Our lecture for this week will examine the ethics of Immanuel Kant. Now, students frequently tell me that Kant's approach to ethics is difficult for them to understand. So what I would recommend for this week is certainly read your chapter like you always do. Make sure you read your white textbook carefully. But I'd also recommend that you watch Michael Sandel's lectures that are posted on D2L so that you can get his explanation of Kant as well as mine. I guess the first thing I'll say about Kant is that his approach to ethics is commonly referred to as a deontological approach to ethics. This simply means that ethics is about discovering certain moral rules or obligations. Deon is a Greek word for duty or obligation, so deontology is the study of those duties or the study of certain rules. So for Kant, his particular approach is to start with what he calls a categorical imperative. This is a method for him for discovering certain correct moral rules. And I want to emphasize that his method and his categorical imperative is about discovering, not about inventing the correct moral rules. That's an important distinction to make with Kant. And his first categorical imperative states that you should act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And an example he gives for this is promise keeping. So one way to think about this first categorical imperative is if you imagine what happens if everyone broke their promises. So you kind of think of the negation of this imperative. So if everyone constantly broke promises, well, that would result in words would become meaningless. If I promise that I'm going to do something, but we are always 100% of the time breaking our promises, then promise keeping would have no meaning. And that gives you an indication, if everyone does the negation of what this imperative is, that gives you an indication that promise keeping is in fact a correct moral law. And so he uses that as an example. He also has a second categorical imperative, which he states that we should always treat humanity as an end, not as a means to an end. So we can state it this way, that we should act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Now, as we are working through the basics of Kant's philosophy, hopefully it will become clear to you what Kant is getting at in each of these imperatives. I will say that even though most people don't use Kant's vocabulary in describing their own moral insights, it's probably also the case that many people do have sort of an unconscious deontological approach to ethics that in some ways can resemble a Kantian framework. So I'll just give you an example. Earlier this semester, we looked at the Queen versus Dudley case from your textbook. You probably remember this. Well, in this case study, there were 4 men who were shipwrecked on July 7th, 1884. 2 of the men, Dudley and Stevens, would eventually be put on trial for murder and for cannibalism, because in this story, Dudley had 2 tins of turnip after they were shipwrecked, and initially he shared those with the other men who were shipwrecked with him. The first tin lasted for 2 days, and then they found a turtle on July 9th. Well, that turtle and the second tin of turnips lasted for about 8 days, but then the men had nothing to eat. Finally, on July 20th, one of the men, a cabin boy named Richard Parker, got sick because he drank seawater. So after the men became desperate for food, they discussed the idea of drawing lots to see who would be sacrificed to save the others on their boat. Brooks, the 4th member of the crew, refused to participate. Well, as Parker's condition got worse, the other men knew that he wasn't going to be lasting for long, and so to speed up what they saw as being inevitable, Dudley said a prayer, then motioned for Stevens to hold the cabin boy's legs, And in the case, we hear that the cabin boy struggled, but then Dudley pushed a penknife into Parker's jugular vein, eventually killing him. Well, we might ask the question, in a case study like this, how should we think about it when it comes to the ethics of it? Well, if we were utilitarians, we might argue, or at least one way to argue would be that this is a situation where the sacrifice of one was necessary to save the lives of three. But I think that many people will find the utilitarian principle unpersuasive or unhelpful in this scenario. I've had many students in the past say things like, I don't care what principle that we use, it should never be okay to eat anyone. That's just wrong. Well, that type of reaction, I think, actually represents a deontological impulse. There's this intuition that we have that there must be some sort of rule that cannibalism is wrong. And so when we think about a deontological approach to ethics, we could really think of them in three different ways. There are instinctual deontological arguments that we make. So this would be the case that cannibalism is just wrong, regardless of the consequences or reasons. There's this instinct that we have that we know it's wrong. There ought to be a rule out there that says it's wrong. There are also reasoned deontological arguments, and this is what Kant is trying to do with his categorical imperative. There are also religious versions of these types of arguments, something like cannibalism maybe contradicts some sort of divine command. But in each of these cases, the assumption is that there are some rules or obligations that people should recognize, rather directly or indirectly, we should recognize them. And what we want to examine with Kant is whether there is a rational way to discover such rules. So to do this, we need to start with some more foundational metaphysical considerations. So let's think about the question of free will. Free will is actually an important question for Kant when he is thinking about ethics. And we might state the question this way. Am I a determined object, or am I a free subject? And so one of the ways we can think about this is we can think about the distinction between freedom and the natural process of cause and effect. If you set up a chain of dominoes, and say you set up 100 dominoes and you position them correctly and you knock over the first domino, and you ask, okay, why did the first domino fall over? Well, the type of explanation that you could give for why the first domino fell would be a personal explanation. It would be a choice explanation that there was a person, namely me, who knocked over the first domino, and that was the cause of that particular domino falling. But now, as the dominoes keep falling, say you get to domino number 57. Why did domino 57 fall? Well, at that point, you can appeal to certain laws of cause and effect because given certain conditions, domino 56 happened to fall. And when domino 56 fell, that caused domino 57 to fall. And after domino 57 fell, it caused domino 58 to fall, and so on and so forth. These are just the natural cause and effect relationships. Well, now how does this relate to the question of free will? Well, if we view ourselves as mere objects in the cosmos, and if we think more specifically, if we think about the human brain as being simply a process of cause and effect synapses, and if we think of consciousness as being reduced to simple brain states, then you could make an argument that we have no free will. There have been some philosophers who have even argued that there is no such thing as a subject. The subject of consciousness is simply an illusion, and all of our thoughts, hopes, dreams, emotions, all of those are simply the processes of impersonal cause and effect relationships. Well, Kant argues if this is the case, if we really have no free will, and we are simply a determined object, determined by particular brain states and there's no free subject inside of us, there's no free agent, then there's no basis for doing ethics. And so he explains it this way. So is there free will? Well, Kant and other philosophers have pointed this out as well. Well, we need to define what we mean by free will, and we need to define what we mean by having limitations on our will. For Kant, he's a libertarian, not libertarian in the sense of ethically a libertarian, but in terms of his notion of free will. And libertarian free will means that we have the ability to reason autonomously. One way to think about this is that there is an agent inside of us that is the first cause of our thoughts and moral judgments. We have the freedom to do that. You could contrast that with a compatibilist notion of free will, which according to compatibilism, there is this notion of free will that we can act according to our desires. But our desires, according to the compatibilists, is not something that's within our control. So we might think about the emotion of happiness. If you decide right now to be happy, but you're authentically sad, the compatibilist says you have no control over that desire, at least no direct control over that desire. Sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're sad, sometimes you're thirsty, sometimes you're not. All the desires or emotions that you have are not directly under your control. So the compatibilist argues that to be free is not to be able to change your desires. Rather, it's the freedom to act according to your desires. And someone like Kant would simply say that if that's what freedom is, that's not true free will in any sense. It sounds more like determinism. So then you have the camp, the determinist camp, who these people sort of bite the bullet and say, well, there is no freedom, it's just cause and effect. And so what Kant says, being a libertarian in his approach to free will, he asks the question, am I, as a free agent, the first cause of my thoughts? And again, the answer for him is yes, because if I'm not, as an agent, the first cause of my thoughts, then I'm not the one who is making any moral judgments. And so for Kant, he argues that reason, when it comes to ethics, is more important than emotion. And this is actually a precondition for morality, according to Kant, that reason is over emotions. Because you're not in control of your desires, as I said, you're not in control of your thirst. So in your textbook, Michael Sandel uses the slogan for Sprite, obey your thirst. Kant would argue that a slogan like this is a poor slogan for ethics. Why? Because you're not in control of your thirsts. And in the same way, you are not in control of your desires, which means for Kant that morality cannot be based upon desire, because desire is not under our control. It's completely arbitrary. What makes me happy or what makes me sad, what gives me pain or what gives me pleasure, is not something that I proactively decide. It's something that happens to me. It's arbitrary. Therefore, there's no moral component to it. So understanding Kant's articulation of freedom helps us understand his preconditions for morality. So he argues that a moral truth must be developed freely if we are to consider it a moral truth at all. And at this point, he makes a distinction between autonomy and heteronomy. So when you're talking about autonomy or autonomous reasoning, that is the ability to act freely, to be a free agent who is in control of your thoughts. And it's the ability to act according to a law that I give myself. And I want to just draw attention to this word I, because for Kant, the I in this sentence does not exist without free will. If there is really to be a conception of the self, a conception of the I, there has to be free, autonomous reasoning. Now, to contrast that with heteronomy, again, that's very similar to the compatibilist notion, which is to act according to desires I haven't chosen for myself, which in a moment we'll look at how Kant is distinct from the utilitarian approach to ethics. So on the utilitarian approach, desires is foundational for ethics, pain and pleasure. Kant argues, well, that's to act heteronomously because you don't choose your pains and your pleasures. But another precondition for morality is that a moral truth must have intrinsic value. And so now we can make this distinction between persons and things. So if we ask the question, why does a block of gold have value? Well, a block of gold is a thing. And for Kant, things don't have intrinsic value. Things only have value if people give things value, which means that a block of gold only has instrumental value. It has value because people or persons say that it has value. But now when we get to people, persons, persons have, for Kant, intrinsic value, meaning that's where moral value begins. And Kant's approach argues that moral rules cannot exist without personal agents. Because for Kant, what is a moral rule if it's not a personal judgment? So we have these two preconditions. A moral truth must be developed freely. We must have free will. And number two, a moral truth must start with intrinsic value, not instrumental value. And then Kant goes on to argue that motives really matter when it comes to ethics. So a person ought to do the right thing because it is the right thing and not for some other motive like utility. So after getting this basic foundation for understanding Kant's moral philosophy, we can contrast his approach both with the utilitarian approach to ethics and with the libertarian approach to ethics. So Kant rejects utilitarianism because it undermines the notion that all humans have inherent dignity. On the utilitarian approach to ethics, it's very much a consequentialist approach to ethics, and it's very much an instrumentalist approach. So you could use one individual for the good of everyone else, which according to Kant undermines the idea that every human being has inherent dignity. But he also rejects the libertarian approach to ethics because he does not think that our dignity comes from the principle of self-ownership. So to state this another way, if you ask, why should we respect individual human rights? Well, a utilitarian who wants to respect individual human rights might say because in the long run, that will bring pleasure for the most amount of people. A libertarian would reject that idea and say we ought to respect individual human rights because of the principle of self-ownership. For Kant, his answer is because that's where morality begins. Morality begins with the fact that we are rational and autonomous beings. And if we are not, there is no such thing as morality in the first place. So now, if we bring all of this together, it gives us a chance to look at three aspects of Kant's philosophy that makes his ethics unique. And we can look at this in terms of three different contrasts. So contrast number one is motives are important for Kant, as we've stated. And the type of motive that we ought to have is a motive of duty. Duty is more important than a motive of inclination. So an action for Kant must be motivated by duty or by a reverence for the moral law for it to be considered a moral act. So actions by themselves don't matter, motives matter. Contrast number two is freedom. So we talked about the distinction between autonomy and heteronomy. For there to be such a thing as a moral action, that action must be governed by reason if it is to truly be free, and that reasoning must be autonomous, completely free. And then contrast 3 is the use of reason. And here's now where he talks about the distinction between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical imperative. And this distinction, he's wanting to draw attention to the fact that an action must be good in itself to be moral. So on a hypothetical imperative, you might say that an action is good because X. So if I'm a teller and somebody comes into the store and wants to buy something from me, and I notice that I give the wrong amount of change back. And I give the wrong amount of change back to my own advantage. And I see this, and the customer is about ready to walk out the store before I notice it, and I have a decision to make. Do I go inform the customer that I shortchanged them, or do I keep the money for myself? Well, in this situation, I decide I should probably give the correct change back to the customer. And the reason, so we could say that's a good moral action, the reason I give is because it will be good for business in the long run. Kant argues that that type of reasoning it brings about a hypothetical imperative. You do the right thing because it creates this benefit. That is an inappropriate way to think about ethics for Kant. We want to discover a categorical imperative, which means imperatives that are good in and of themselves. So in other words, giving the right change back is the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do. It is something that we ought to recognize. Well, then we can ask the obvious question at this point: what exactly is the categorical imperative? And we could ask, how do we discover the categorical imperative? And we're going to look at two distinctions here that we began with. You discover a categorical imperative if it can become a universal law. So categorical imperative number 1, act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So again, with this, if you can imagine the opposite of, say, promise keeping, and so you give the opposite command, you ought to always break promises. If that creates a situation where promise keeping becomes meaningless, then that's a good indication that that's a categorical imperative. So you could think of things like telling the truth, promise keeping, do not murder. These would be example. If you imagine the negation, it would create a self-defeating situation. And the second categorical imperative, treat humanity as an end, to act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. And Kant argues that everyone who exercises pure practical reason of this nature will eventually reach the same conclusion. So that's a basic introduction to Kant's philosophy. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, his philosophy is perhaps the most difficult to understand, at least out of the philosophers we look at in this course. So I do recommend reading your chapter carefully. Watch the recommended videos posted on D2L so that you can get Michael Sandel's perspective on Kant. And if you still have questions, please don't hesitate to ask.